If you want to know the secrets of existence and the true meaning of life, I can't help you. But if you want some book recommendations, why not try reading the ones I wrote? If you're a fan of giant monster mayhem and anime weirdness, why not try Operation Red Dragon: The Daikaiju Wars Part 1? If horror is more your style, you can't go wrong with The Occult Mafia. Those who enjoy their fantasy with a dark twist may be interested in Emerald of Maddox City. And if you're interested in shared universes, why not read all three? Hop on down to the description for links to all three books on Amazon. Enjoy whichever ones you read, and enjoy the video. Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am the Omni viewer, and we are officially at episode 12 of Godzilla Singular Point. The finale is within sight. And this episode honestly felt kinda like padding in a lot of ways. So what is there to talk about? Well, I think episode 12 is the first episode where I've really seen bad animation. For the most part, the series has done a pretty good job of blending its 2D and 3D effects, but there's this extended period in which May and company are walking around through the underground that leads to the Shiva computer, and they just don't blend in at all, and it really sticks out. There have been moments here and there in previous episodes where the animation has maybe been a little stilted, or maybe the 3D elements didn't look quite right, but they usually went by pretty quickly. These moments lasted a little longer, so they actually were like, wow, I can see that, and it's actually leaving an impact. So, I mean, that's a superficial detail, and I guess I'm impressed that it took this long to have something like that happen, but I still feel like it's worth mentioning. The biggest development of this episode is that Mothra has finally showed up, or I guess it would actually be more accurate to say Fairy Mothra, because there are a bunch of tiny little Mothras flying around, sort of like what we saw in Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla. And the fact that Mothra has shown up so randomly doesn't necessarily surprise me, because that's what monsters do in this show. They just appear, you turn around a corner, there's a monster all of a sudden, just accept it. And yes, I know it has something to do with the singular points, it doesn't make their introductions any less jarring. But if Mothra is showing up now, right before the finale, I'm anticipating a Deus Ex Machina. I'm anticipating that Mothra is going to somehow be vital to the plot working out in humanity's favor. Because I just can't imagine an anime where Mothra shows up only to have a very minor impact on the story and then just disappear. You know, again, that happened in the Polygon trilogy, but it feels like since the monsters are more active in this series, Mothra is going to be more active as well. She's going to follow suit. And I'm not sure I'm looking forward to that. A Deus Ex Machina, you know, that's kind of tricky. Sometimes it can be justified in very, very rare occasions. Suppose, for example, you're telling a religious story and the whole point is that you have to rely on God or some higher force in order to save you. Well, then having a Deus Ex Machina is kind of the point. You still have to execute it very specifically in order to make it feel like it's not cheap, but that's not really what Singular Point is about. So, yeah, I'm once again bracing myself. I've got so many braces at this point, it's a wonder I can move. But otherwise, like I said, this episode just sort of felt like padding. Like, we already know that there has to be a very specific set of circumstances for when they can use the orthogonal diagonalizer against Godzilla, because they need to get a code from May. And the stuff with May at the Shiva computer, I guess you can say is necessary, but again, a lot of it is just them walking. It's May going from one location to another, yet again, except she's on foot this time. What a change. And in Tokyo, meanwhile, it's basically just like they don't know what to do with Yun and Jet Jaguar and the rest of the Otaki Factory crew, you know, minus the one pink-haired goth woman who has disappeared, and I'm not even sure why she was there to begin with. But it seems like no one's sure what to do with them, so they're just sort of standing around discussing what needs to happen. Except since those guys already know what needs to happen, they had to bring in some other characters from outside of this whole situation so they could have it explained to them. And yeah, it feels just sort of like otherwise they'd be standing around waiting. Aside from a moment where, once again, Jet Jaguar gets to have a fight with some Rodans. But even then, it feels kind of... I don't know. It feels, again, like it was just thrown in there so they could say they met their quota. What's more, I've also mentioned that the first Rodans, the ones that had the drastically different designs, are suddenly reappearing. And the fact that they are back without explanation and moving alongside the darker, smaller, two-horned Rodans has me wondering about, not about the show, but about the explanations I've been seeing for certain things. Because every time I say something in this series doesn't make much sense, someone will always come along with a certain bit of information that says, this is what's going on, how could you have missed that? And I'm always thinking, I don't recall hearing anything like that said in the dialogue, but maybe, and I'm struggling to think whether or not that's actually the case, but with the Rodans, I feel like if I say that makes no sense that they would come back now, I actually have some evidence that the show didn't say anything. Because the new Rodans, the ones that look a bit more like the traditional one, showed up without explanation. We haven't seen the bright red ones since, and there was no explanation as to where they came from. The best that anyone could say was that it seemed like they were a different kind of Rodan because they were smaller and they looked different, but they couldn't really say anything beyond that. But I happen to have seen some expanded materials, if you will, which say that the more traditional looking Rodans, more traditional by comparison at least, are the adult versions of those bright red ones, which are juveniles, which is mentioned nowhere in the show. At least not in the English dub, but assuming that the English dub didn't just plain cut any of that information, which if it did is a huge mistake, then that information wasn't in the show at all. So now I'm wondering how much of the explanations that I've been hearing for what's going on in this series actually comes from those external sources. Because if that's the case, then that information was in the wrong place. I mean, if I've said it once, I've said it a million times. If the information vital to understanding what's happening on screen is in a completely different location and the audience has to go off and find that information somewhere else, then that information was in the wrong place. Maybe that's the case for some of the explanations I've heard before, and maybe it's not, but the fact that at least one bit of information can be found in an external source, and the fact that it was recently announced that Singular Point was actually going to have a guidebook published, that tells me that this is yet another one of those stories where you have to do your homework in order to figure out what's going on. Which, if that's the case, yet again, this is not a very well told story. The audience should not have to go on a scavenger hunt in order to get information that should have been in there from the beginning. That bad animation shot I mentioned earlier actually does segue into a grander point about the series as a whole. As the characters are walking along and trying to get to the computer, once again moving very casually, even taking into account that some of the path is treacherous, they don't really seem to be in much of a hurry. But as they're walking, once again they are talking. And seeing it this time around basically gave me an epiphany. Once again, it was something I had always known about the show, but this is what really brought it to the foremost of my thoughts. It's the fact that there's a second reason, beyond the one I've already mentioned, as to why all the technobabble in this series feels inaccessible to a lot of people. The reason is because it's all talk. Literally, it is all talk. The thing is, Godzilla Singular Point is an animated series. And the beautiful thing about animation as a medium is that literally anything can be shown. If it can be drawn, no matter how wild it is or whether or not it could physically exist in the real world, as long as you can either draw it or render it in the computer somehow, you can make it exist. This comes in handy for exposition-heavy scenes because you can provide visual aid for what is being said. You don't have to just show the characters having a conversation in whatever setting they are in. You can actually show us what they are talking about. You know, that old rule, show, don't tell, which Godzilla anime in general seems to have a huge problem with. Suppose we had these characters talking about all of this science jargon the whole time, but we also had visual aids to help us. And I'm not talking about cutting to a text chat. That doesn't count. Just because it's a different visual doesn't mean it's not still just watching two people talk. It's just that we can't see the people in that scenario. I'm talking about actually providing visual examples of what's being said. Even if you still don't technically understand every $10 word and all the finer details of it, you can at least still get a better idea of what it actually is. The closest we've gotten to that is looking at Ashihara's notes, but then again, Ashihara's notes are meant to be crazy and nearly impossible to decipher unless you're a genius. So I'm not really sure that counts either. And I've seen other anime do this, whether it's Martian Successor Nadeshiko explaining how the starship works, or Hellsing Ultimate explaining certain historical events. There's always some sort of visual aid, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that complex, but as long as it provides some sort of visual, the audience, even if they don't understand it, can make a little bit more sense of it. But instead with Godzilla Singular Point, we're just listening to the characters talk. And when you're just listening to characters talk without much interesting visually going on, you're liable to zone out. I mean, take this video as an example. I'm just sitting here talking, and I bet quite a few of you out there just have me on as background noise and you're not even looking at the video. You probably are either looking at something else on your tablet or your computer or whatever, or you're doing something around the house while listening to me drone on and on about this series, and you're not actually looking at me. And I'm not chastising you for it. I've done the same thing, and if given the choice, I wouldn't want to stare at my hideous mug either. But you can do that with this sort of video. But in my videos where I've actually got footage or images of what I'm talking about, that's a video you're more likely to actually watch, isn't it? Because you want to see how what I'm saying relates to what is being shown. There you go. That's what Singular Point could have done, but it's not what it did do. And the result is that not only is the technobabble inaccessible because we don't care about the characters, it's also inaccessible because we have nothing to help us visualize it. Or at least when we do have something to help us visualize it, it's either meant to be as inscrutable as the dialogue, or it's very quick and not all that interesting to look at anyway, like when May did that little example of explaining wormholes with a piece of Jell-O. Okay, that didn't really serve too much in terms of visual interest. That's comparable to the That's a Big Twinkie scene from Ghostbusters, which, in that case, it was a joke. I've noticed that a lot of the people who praise Godzilla Singular Point praise it for being a very intelligent show, because it spouts all of this scientific mumbo-jumbo and jargon and whatnot, and it's all stuff that goes over most people's heads, so people think, hey, that's really smart sounding, must mean this is a really smart show, and hey, Toenjo happens to have a background in real science and physics and stuff, so this must be the smartest Godzilla show ever written. Me, on the other hand, I look at this and a saying comes to mind, an old phrase from however far back. Knowledge is knowing that tomatoes are fruits. Wisdom is knowing that tomatoes don't belong in fruit salad. And I feel like the crew behind Godzilla Singular Point might have missed that particular saying. They have a lot of knowledge, they know a lot of stuff, but they don't know how to actually weave it into a story. They don't know how to make it palatable to the audience. Is the science in Godzilla Singular Point real, or at least theoretically feasible? It probably is. I haven't actually had the time to look up most of it, but it sounds like it's grounded in something. But that doesn't change the fact that the story, the way in which this information is being conveyed, doesn't work. Just fundamentally, it has got such huge flaws that I'm kind of surprised more people aren't talking about that. And I've seen it done. I know it can be done. I brought up 2001: A Space Odyssey in another video. I've not only seen the movie, I've read the book, and done the same for its immediate sequel, 2010. I haven't read 2061 or 3001 yet. I'm working on that. But I've experienced that particular series, and that's hard sci-fi. That's also got some pretty high concept stuff. Moreover, when I was younger and my dad read me bedtime stories, one of the things he read to me was Isaac Asimov's entire Foundation series, another work of hard sci-fi. And yes, I did understand it. I probably would understand a lot more of it if I went back and read it as an adult, which I've been meaning to do. But the fact is, even as a kid, who probably had a lot of the finer subtext and stuff go over his head, I still understood enough of the Foundation series when it was being read to me to not be put off by it, not be bored, not be lost. I followed the story. And, well, Godzilla Singular Point falls short of those standards. I know it can be done. I like hard sci-fi. It's not necessarily my go-to genre, but I do still like it, and when it's done well, it can be done really, really well. But Godzilla Singular Point, for as hard as it's trying, just doesn't seem to get there. So in some ways, it feels like I'm at a restaurant where this world-renowned chef has served a brand new dish with ingredients that just don't go well together, and I'm watching a whole bunch of other people choking it down and saying, well, it must be good because the chef his reputation precedes him, and it must be our fault for not really appreciating this new flavor sensation. And I'm the one who's standing up and saying, no, this tastes awful. I was looking forward to it, the appetizer was fine, but I'm not liking the actual main course. And, you know, not to say that the people who like Godzilla Singular Point are wrong. People are allowed to like what they like. But I don't get why. Not when the flaws are this great. Not when... I just don't understand. Maybe the finale really does accomplish a miracle, because the final episode is the last impression you leave your audience with, and maybe it's just so incredible, so brilliant, that it will wash away the sins of everything that's come before it. But I'm not holding my breath, once again, because I happen to like breathing. Well, only one episode to go. Just a reminder that Gridman had already finished its story by this point and told it much more efficiently, but we'll see what happens in the finale, and I'll see you all there. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off. If you enjoyed what you just saw, hop on down to the description for links to Patreon, DeviantArt, and all of our social media, as well as links for Operation Red Dragon, The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, The Occult Mafia, and Emerald of Maddox City, 3 original novels I think you'll really enjoy. Thank you all, and we appreciate your support.